I'm Dr. Nick Sutton, and I'm in the library here at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, which is on Magdalen Street in the centre of Oxford. Right, now I want to turn to consider what we might refer to as modern trends in Hindu thought, and particularly the substantial transformations that have taken place in the Hindu world over the last 100 years. I'm going to touch briefly on some of the major figures, people like Ram Mohan Roy, Dayanand Saraswati, Swami Vivekananda, and then Mahatma Gandhi. But before looking at them as individuals, I want to try and consider the circumstances, the environment, and the political conditions which gave rise to them adopting the teachings and the positions that they did do. We're aware from our understanding of the history of India that certainly by 1800 to 1850, the whole of India had fallen under British rule, supplanting the previous anarchy and prior to that Islamic rule of almost all of India. The British attitude towards Hinduism was initially one of just letting Hindus carry on with it. They were, after all, there to make money, to exploit the riches of India, and the feeling was that if we let the people to practice their religion as they want, then that will keep them happy, so we can go on printing money out of this country. Towards the end of the 19th century, you've got an evangelical movement in Britain, which puts pressure on the government and the East India Company to allow missionaries to become active in India, and so you've got an intense period, perhaps maybe right up till the middle of the 20th century, an intense period of missionary activity. And simultaneously, from the beginning of the 19th century, we've got the beginnings of the Nationalist Movement, which seeks to liberate India from British rule. And it's in that context that we see the modern teachers of Hinduism formulating their ideas and working towards religious reform. Okay, I would suggest that both the secular rulers of India, the British rulers of India, and the Christian missionaries saw it as useful to systematically denigrate all native customs. I think it was Governor Macaulay who famously said that all the books ever written in Sanskrit and Persian were not equal in value to one shelf of a decent European library. And that attitude is predominant, obviously, from the missionaries. They're old-style Christians, they're Christian supremacists. They believe that Christianity is the one true faith and that all other religions, including Hinduism, are either gross errors of primitive, stupid people, or else perhaps works of the devil to lead people towards hell. They certainly believe that every Hindu, and every Muslim for that matter, was destined for eternal damnation. Don't know what sort of God they believed in. He certainly wasn't a particularly pleasant character, damning and torturing. But that was the belief, that unless the Hindus converted to Christianity, they were going to be damned. And a part of Christian preaching was not just to glorify Christ, the revelation of Christ, but to try and point out the shortcomings, the faults of the Hindu revelation. Similarly, the British rulers of India. British are peculiar imperialists, perhaps a little bit unlike the French and certainly unlike the Germans, who were pretty much open about it, why they were there. They wanted to control, dominate and exploit. The British had this kind of vision expressed by Kipling in his words, "Take up the white man's burden," that somehow British imperialism was for the benefit of the Indians. We're here to help you. We're here to bestow upon you the gifts of European civilization. It's not we're here to rip you off and take all your money and control you. We're here to, we're spreading. It's a bit like the Red Cross or something to spread the benefits of our civilization to you. Of course, it can't. They're there for one reason. They're there to make money, and that comes out at different times, like when Dyer mows down people in Amritsar in 1921. There's underneath the velvet glove, there's an iron fist to British rule. But still, there's an ideology of imperialism. And this is justified, as we maybe some of the accounts of Gandhi's negotiations with the British, by the British statement that, well, we'd like you to rule yourselves, but it's just not possible because you're not civilised enough for self-rule. When you've had maybe another 100 years or 200 years of good British civilising, then you'll be up to our standard, then we can maybe leave. So, in a sense, the British justify their imperialistic presence by a parallel denigration of native culture and native religion. So for nationalist reasons and for religious reasons, Hinduism is under attack, not direct physical attack, but ideological, verbal attack from the religious and secular leaders of the British presence in India. And many of the leaders of the reform movement and the nationalist movement, you mentioned Aurobindo, etc., were people who had been educated by the British. Swami Vivekananda, educated in Calcutta, was a student of European philosophy, an expert on Hegel, I think, in his earlier teenage years. And they are aware of British attitudes towards the Hindu tradition. And there are certain areas in particular that the British condemnation focuses on in terms of Hindu society, Hindu religious practice. British people were quite admiring of texts like the Gita. In fact, some Christians claim that the Gita must be a Christian work. Like Hindus couldn't possibly have made this up. It's too good to be Hindu. It must have been some Indian Christians who wrote it for them. And maybe the Upanishads as well, if they could understand them. But what they really focused on was practices, particularly in relation to Hindu women, gender, not that Victorian women were treated that well, and also caste, which they regarded as iniquitous. And you've got this sort of stream of Hindu horror stories coming back to Britain, things like the human sacrifice at the Jagannath temple. We still have in British, we've still got the word juggernaut, which we talk about a big lorry, and that comes into the Victorian vocabulary because we're getting these horror stories at the Jagannath temple. The priests offer human sacrifice to the bloodthirsty idol. The writings are still, you can still see them. In fact, what had happened is a few people had fallen over because there was such a big crowd and got crushed. But the story that came back was human sacrifice. We've got things like the thugs. We still use the word in English, a thug. This kind of Kali worshipping, devilish cult of human sacrifice. Again, it wasn't true. The thugs were just bandits, really, and some of them were Muslims. So there wasn't a Kali worshipping devil cult or anything like that. But still, this comes filtering back. And then you've got sati as well, the mass slaughter of widows. It did happen, but on a very limited scale. But it was in the British interest, missionary and secular, to exaggerate the iniquities of the Hindu system, and the caste system as well was regarded as hugely iniquitous. Although, has to be said, the Victorian society was, even in Britain, was largely caste-based and utterly discriminatory against the lower social classes. Nonetheless, Hindus who sought to liberate India from British rule accepted the validity of certain criticisms, and they therefore saw the nationalist struggle as being a part, as a part of the nationalist struggle, the need to transform Hinduism into a form of religiosity, a form of spirituality that would be acceptable to the modern world, which would demonstrate quite clearly that India was a great civilization that certainly should be allowed to rule itself. So in a sense, nationalism and reform go hand in hand, and we see this particularly in a figure like Mahatma Gandhi, who is known for being the leader of the Indian nationalist movement, but at the same time was absolutely committed to social reform. Let's look then. And I think it's, you know, the criticisms weren't entirely fabricated. I think what you find is that when a society, a culture and a religion is under pressure from outside domination, as Hinduism had been for many centuries of Islamic rule, it tends to become hidebound and rule-bound. It loses its spontaneity.